Today, we are confronted with yet another dramatic episode in the unfolding saga of global trade tensions. Former President Donald Trump, never one to shy away from bold and polarizing demands, has set his sights northward. His latest declaration insists that Canadian ports should serve American trade interests more directly, effectively bending Canadian sovereignty to U.S. economic priorities. And yet, the response from Mark Carney, Canada's finance minister and former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, has been an unflinching refusal. He has drawn a firm line in the sand, rejecting what he characterizes as an assault on Canada's independence and its economic dignity. The clash here is not just about ports, it is about power, sovereignty, and the deep fractures in the global capitalist order. Former President Donald Trump's bold demand that Canadian ports be redirected to serve American trade interests is far more than just another dramatic soundbite in the political theater he has long mastered. It is a revealing statement about the current state of U.S. economic policy, its vulnerabilities, and the increasingly confrontational approach to allies that once were considered untouchable. To fully grasp the magnitude of this moment, we must dig beneath the headline, because the demand is not about docks and shipping lanes alone. It is about asserting dominance at a time when that dominance is visibly eroding. This is why the story matters, and this is why the hooks here are sharper than they may appear at first glance. When Trump frames his demand, it is not simply a tactical move about logistics or commerce. It is a symbolic gesture designed to project strength, to suggest that the United States can and should dictate terms even to its closest neighbors. That symbolism is crucial because it appeals to a domestic audience that feels left behind by globalization and economic restructuring. To tell his supporters that he is willing to demand control over Canadian ports is to tell them he is still fighting for American supremacy in a world where supremacy feels increasingly out of reach. He is giving voice to an old nostalgia, the idea that the United States once commanded unquestioned authority over trade routes, resources, and economic outcomes, and that it can somehow claw back that authority by sheer force of will. Yet here lies the deeper irony. This demand exposes not American strength, but American weakness. A confident, secure economy does not need to lean on its allies' infrastructure to sustain itself. It does not need to make public demands that risk diplomatic fallout. The very fact that Trump elevates this issue speaks to the pressures bearing down on the United States, pressures of persistent trade deficits, industrial decline, and the rise of competitors who no longer defer to Washington's preferences. The demand is an attempt to mask these vulnerabilities by projecting an image of control. But as every economist knows, when power must be declared loudly, it is often because it is slipping quietly away. For Canada, the request strikes at the heart of sovereignty. Ports are not merely physical spaces where goods arrive and depart. They are lifelines of economic independence. To cede control, even partially, would be to hand over a piece of national identity and authority. Trump's demand, therefore, was always destined to provoke resistance. And yet, it is precisely that resistance that adds another layer of intrigue. By making such an audacious request, Trump essentially forced Canada into a position where refusal became inevitable, and that refusal now stands as a public rebuke of U.S. pressure. This plays out not only in trade circles, but in the broader narrative of shifting global alliances, where smaller nations are increasingly emboldened to resist American dictates. The hook for observers here is the question, why now? Why is Trump targeting Canada, a long-standing ally bound by geography, history, and deeply integrated supply chains? The answer lies in the domestic political calculus. In demanding Canadian ports, Trump sends a message to his supporters that he is unafraid to push even friendly nations into submission. He reframes Canada not as a partner, but as a resource to be exploited in service of American revival. For an electorate frustrated by job losses, wage stagnation, and economic inequality, this kind of rhetoric resonates powerfully. It plays into the desire for simple, forceful answers to complex structural problems. But it is also misleading because securing access to Canadian ports does nothing to address the root causes of U.S. economic malaise. We should not underestimate the theater of this demand. Trump has always understood that politics is as much about narrative as it is about policy. The narrative he is crafting is one of renewed dominance, America first, America demanding, America reclaiming what it believes is rightfully its own. In doing so, he obscures the reality that global capitalism no longer functions on unilateral American terms. Instead, power is dispersed, contested, and increasingly slipping from Washington's grip. The demand for Canadian ports, therefore, is less about practical outcomes and more about staging a scene in which the United States appears forceful, assertive, and unwilling to concede ground. The other hook worth noting is how such demands reshape global perceptions of the United States. Allies watch closely, and when they see Trump turning pressure toward Canada, they draw conclusions about the reliability and fairness of American partnership. If even Canada can be treated as a subordinate, what does that mean for nations with fewer historical or geographical ties? This demand risks not only alienating Canada, but also sending ripples across the international community, where the U.S. is already struggling to maintain credibility. Power is not just exercised, it is also perceived. And the perception here is of a country lashing out, seeking shortcuts to maintain its influence rather than engaging in the harder work of restructuring its economy to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The demand for Canadian ports is a window into the contradictions of America's current position. On the one hand, it seeks to project dominance to remind the world of its still formidable economic clout. On the other, it exposes the very fragility of that clout by revealing how reliant the U.S. has become on asserting control over others. In the end, the boldness of Trump's demand will be remembered not as a demonstration of American power, but as evidence of the growing cracks in that power. And that is what makes this episode so telling, so revealing, and so necessary for us to understand. Mark Carney's outright rejection of Donald Trump's demand for Canadian ports represents more than a polite dismissal of an unreasonable request. It is a bold act of defiance that carries symbolic weight far beyond trade policy. When Carney, a seasoned statesman and economist who has led two of the world's most influential central banks, speaks with such clarity and finality, it signals a deliberate choice to stand firm against pressures that might otherwise have gone unchallenged. This refusal is not simply a matter of logistics, it is a declaration that Canada will not sacrifice sovereignty, identity, or independence on the altar of another nation's political theater. The importance of this refusal becomes clearer when we recall how deeply intertwined the Canadian and American economies have been for decades. Canada exports the majority of its goods to the United States. Its industries are closely integrated with U.S. supply chains, and its financial markets are heavily influenced by U.S. trends. In such a context, it might seem risky for a Canadian finance minister to openly contradict American demands. And yet, Carney's rejection was swift and unflinching. This is the hook that draws our attention when a country so tied to the U.S. economy decides to push back. It means the pressure being exerted has crossed a critical threshold. It means Canada is no longer willing to quietly absorb every demand without considering the broader implications for its autonomy. Carney's refusal is also rooted in an understanding of how ports operate within the larger framework of sovereignty. A nation's ports are not merely docking points for ships, they are strategic arteries through which commerce, security, and identity flow. To hand over decision-making power, even symbolically, would be akin to conceding a portion of national territory. Carney's economic training equips him to see the slippery slope such concessions create. If ports can be demanded today, what about energy infrastructure tomorrow? What about digital networks or critical resources in the future? By saying no now, Carney is not only protecting Canada's ports, he is setting a precedent for resisting creeping attempts at control over other facets of national life. This refusal is particularly striking because Carney is not a figure known for populist grandstanding. He is measured, technocratic, and deeply analytical. His words are not chosen for shock value, but for strategic precision. That makes his rejection more powerful because it comes not from a desire to stir nationalist sentiment, but from a sober recognition of economic and political realities. He is signaling that the health of Canada's economy depends not just on access to markets, but on the ability to make decisions free from coercion. And this is where the deeper hook emerges. Sovereignty, once ceded, is rarely regained without cost. Carney understands this and acts accordingly. The refusal also speaks to the broader dynamics of the U.S.-Canada relationship. For decades, Canada has lived in the shadow of its larger neighbor, often finding its voice muted in global discussions dominated by Washington. But in this moment, Carney's stance transforms Canada from a quiet partner into a vocal defender of its own autonomy. This is a reminder to the world that even smaller nations can draw firm boundaries against superpowers, and that alliances, no matter how close, do not equate to submission. In this sense, the refusal becomes a global message. The age of automatic compliance with American demands is fading, and nations are increasingly prepared to assert their independence, even at economic risk. There is also a domestic dimension to consider. Carney's rejection plays well within Canada itself, where citizens are often wary of American overreach. By refusing Trump's demand, Carney positions himself not only as a defender of economic policy, but also as a protector of national dignity. That matters in a democratic system where leaders must answer to their people. Canadians are unlikely to support any move that allows the U.S. to dictate the terms of their infrastructure use. Carney's clear refusal, therefore, resonates as an act of leadership grounded in respect for public sentiment and national pride. It reinforces the idea that Canada is not a passive player in global affairs, but an active agent capable of standing tall even in the face of pressure from its most powerful ally. On the international stage, this refusal also reshapes perceptions of both countries. For allies of Canada, it demonstrates courage and independence, qualities that may attract admiration in a world where many nations are wary of U.S. dominance. For the United States, however, It reveals a vulnerability. Even those closest to Washington are no longer guaranteed to fall in line. Carney's refusal, in effect, chips away at the image of inevitable American compliance and projects an alternative vision of global politics where smaller nations can and do say no. The hook that makes this moment so striking lies in the contrast between expectation and reality. The expectation might have been that Canada, as it has done in the past, would quietly accommodate or at least negotiate around U.S. demands. The reality, however, is that Carney slammed the door shut and in doing so shifted the tone of the conversation. That sharp break from expectation is what gives this refusal its dramatic power and why it resonates far beyond the specifics of ports and trade. Carney's rejection is not just a refusal to a single demand, it is a stance that encapsulates the broader struggles of smaller nations navigating a world still dominated by larger powers. It is a reminder that sovereignty remains a non-negotiable principle for those unwilling to be reduced to pawns in another country's game. And in a moment where global trade tensions are already high, his firm response adds a new layer of complexity to the ongoing story of shifting alliances and contested power. The rising tensions between the United States and Canada over Trump's demand for Canadian ports are not just a minor dispute between neighbors, they are symptomatic of larger cracks appearing in the global trade order. When two countries with one of the most integrated economic relationships in the world begin to clash openly, it signals that something far deeper than logistics is at play. Trade partnerships are built on trust, predictability, and mutual respect, and when those foundations begin to shift, the ripple effects extend far beyond bilateral ties. What we are witnessing here is not simply a disagreement about access to shipping facilities. It is the unraveling of long-standing assumptions about the way global trade is supposed to work. That is the hook which draws attention. If the U.S. and Canada are at odds, then no alliance is immune to fracture. For decades, U.S.-Canada relations have been defined by the North American Free Trade Agreement and its successor, the USMCA. These agreements created a framework where both nations benefited from relatively stable flows of goods, services, and capital. American companies relied on Canadian resources, while Canadian businesses leaned heavily on access to the U.S. market. But Trump's demand and Carney's refusal have punctured the illusion that this framework guarantees cooperation. Instead, it reveals the growing reality that even formal trade agreements cannot protect against political pressures, nationalistic posturing, and the deeper anxieties produced by a global economy in flux. When the rules can be rewritten, or worse, ignored, what happens to the system that has underpinned prosperity for decades? This question becomes even sharper when we widen the lens to include the broader context of U.S. trade policy. The United States has increasingly shifted from being a champion of multilateralism to pursuing a more unilateral, transactional approach. Trump's rhetoric of America first was not confined to adversaries like China or Mexico. It extended even to trusted partners like Canada and the European Union. The demand for Canadian ports is a continuation of this logic. Trade is no longer about mutual benefit, but about maximizing American leverage, even at the cost of alienating allies. The hook here is the danger embedded in this approach. When allies feel treated like subordinates, they begin to resist, and that resistance undermines the very cohesion Washington needs to maintain influence in an increasingly competitive world. This rising tension also highlights the fragility of global supply chains. Ports are not just national assets, they are critical nodes in the circulation of goods across continents. A dispute over who controls them or how they are used can create uncertainty that ripples across industries from manufacturing to agriculture. Businesses rely on predictability to make investments, plan production, and move goods efficiently. If political battles turn ports into bargaining chips, that predictability evaporates. The fear of instability itself becomes a cost, discouraging investment and eroding trust. The clash between Trump and Carney, therefore, is not merely a diplomatic spat, it is a reminder that political power struggles can easily destabilize the arteries of global commerce. What makes this moment even more revealing is the timing. The global economy is already under strain from slowing growth, rising debt levels, and competition among emerging powers. Countries like China are building alternative trade routes, expanding influence through initiatives like the Belt and Road. The European Union is recalibrating its own economic strategies to reduce reliance on the US. In such a context, for Washington to pick a fight with Ottawa looks not like strength, but like distraction. And yet, for Trump, the domestic political payoff may seem worth it. His supporters do not measure success in terms of global cohesion, but in terms of symbolic victories. Standing up to anyone, even an ally, signals toughness. But the international audience sees something different, a U.S. willing to jeopardize long-standing alliances for the sake of short-term political theater. The cracks revealed in this episode extend to the very narrative of globalization itself. For years, the dominant story was that trade liberalization tied nations so closely together that conflict would be costly and therefore rare. But what we see here is evidence that political pressure can override economic rationality. The U.S. is willing to risk a confrontation with Canada, not because it makes sense in terms of efficiency or growth, but because it plays well in the domestic political arena. This undermines the idea that economics always trumps politics in shaping international relations. Instead, it reveals the opposite. Politics, driven by populism and nationalist sentiment, can override economic logic and threaten the stability of trade systems once considered invincible. Another hook worth emphasizing is the precedent this sets. If the United States can openly pressure Canada, what message does that send to other allies? Japan, South Korea, and European nations are all watching closely. They see that being a close partner does not shield them from demands and pressure tactics. This realization can foster mistrust and accelerate efforts by these countries to diversify their trade relationships away from dependence on the U.S. That, in turn, weakens the very leverage Washington seeks to maintain. In this way, the attempt to strengthen American dominance could paradoxically hasten its decline. At its core, the U.S.-Canada clash is a microcosm of the broader challenges facing the global trade order. Trust is eroding, rules are being bent, and the balance of power is shifting. The old assumption that America's allies would always fall in line no longer holds. Carney's refusal marks a moment of resistance that is both symbolic and practical. It underscores that sovereignty still matters in an interconnected world, and it demonstrates that even smaller nations are no longer willing to quietly accept demands framed in the language of dominance. The fracture here is not just between two countries, it is between two visions of how trade and power should function in the 21st century. The political and economic impact of Trump's demand and Carney's rejection reaches far beyond the exchange of words between two leaders. It carries implications for how citizens view leadership, how markets assess risk, and how allies recalculate their trust in America's role on the world stage. When a U.S. president demands concessions from Canada, a nation historically framed as one of America's closest and most dependable partners, the world takes notice. And when Canada responds with defiance, refusing to concede, the narrative shifts from one of unquestioned American dominance to one of fractured partnerships and declining leverage. That shift is not theoretical, it is real, and it is reshaping the way politics and economics intertwine in this era of uncertainty. For Trump, the political calculation is straightforward. His demand plays directly to his domestic base, the millions of Americans who feel abandoned by decades of globalization and deindustrialization. By taking a hard line even with allies, Trump paints himself as the fighter willing to challenge anyone, friend or foe, in the name of American workers. The hook is clear, strength sells. It resonates with voters in industrial heartlands who see globalization not as opportunity but as betrayal. Yet, while the political theater may be effective in galvanizing support, it does little to address the structural issues at the root of economic discontent. No control over Canadian ports will reopen shuttered factories or reverse the deep technological and financial shifts that have transformed the U.S. economy. The economic consequences of such posturing are far less favorable than the political optics suggest. Trade thrives on stability, predictability, and trust. When a leader uses trade infrastructure as a bargaining chip, the perception of risk increases. Investors begin to wonder whether agreements are reliable, whether supply chains are secure, and whether political interference will disrupt the flow of goods. Canada's refusal in this case may have preserved its sovereignty, but it also injects uncertainty into the bilateral relationship. Businesses that depend on seamless trade between the two countries must now factor in the possibility of further conflict, tariffs, or retaliatory measures. That uncertainty is itself costly, it discourages investment, and makes long-term planning precarious. From an international perspective, the episode has an even larger resonance. Other nations watch closely how America treats its allies because it signals how they themselves might be treated in future disputes. Carney's refusal demonstrates that even smaller nations are prepared to resist, a message that emboldens others to do the same. At the same time, it weakens the perception that America can command compliance from partners at will. The hook here is the image of a declining empire, one whose demands no longer carry the inevitability they once did. That shift in perception is powerful because global power rests as much on reputation as it does on raw economic or military might. Domestically within Canada, Carney's rejection plays as a point of pride. Canadians are often wary of being overshadowed by their southern neighbor, and this moment provides a rare instance of publicly standing firm against U.S. pressure. Politically, it strengthens Carney's position as a defender of national interest while also reminding Canadian citizens that sovereignty requires vigilance. Economically, it reassures industries that Canada will not easily bend to foreign demands, even when those demands come from its largest trading partner. That kind of reassurance matters for building confidence in domestic markets and fostering a sense of resilience against external shocks. The broader impact, however, lies in how this dispute reshapes the U.S.-Canada dynamic. within the context of the global economy. For decades, Canada has been considered a reliable partner, quietly supporting U.S. economic interests. This clash signals a potential rebalancing of that relationship, where Canada asserts more independence and where U.S. leaders must recognize that even close allies have limits. For Trump, the political win may be short term, but the economic and diplomatic costs could linger. Every refusal chips away at the aura of American inevitability, and every act of resistance signals a world less willing to accommodate U.S. unilateralism. The lasting hook in this moment is the duality of perception for Trump's base. The demand represents strength and defiance. For global observers, it represents insecurity and decline. That contrast is what makes this episode so compelling. It captures the paradox of modern American power, a nation still unmatched in scale, but increasingly unable to convert that scale into unquestioned obedience. And it shows how even a close ally like Canada can shift the balance by simply refusing to play the role assigned to it.